Hello, this is Janet Fitch, and if it's noon on Wednesday, it must be Writing Wednesday, where I answer your writing questions and questions about craft, questions about the writing life, specifics and generals. Put them in the comments if you have questions for me, and I will answer them. And if you have questions for me during the week and you send them to me through my email, through my website, janetfitchwrites.com, I can design a Writing Wednesday around your question. So I have just finished teaching a weekend intensive, a very intensive weekend on point of view. And it was wonderful. It gave me a chance to really take the grand tour of point of view. Hi, Jeffrey. And funny enough, the questions that I have for today are both point of view questions. So the first question that I have today is from Barbara. And Barbara is also a writing teacher and a writer that I very much, we're in kind of in a state of communion, let's just say. We get along pretty well. But she has a student. Here's the letter. Dear Janet, I have a student who is writing a completely unlikable character. He's totally unempathetic, apart from being unlikable. My student said, I don't know how to do that, make him empathetic. And I said, does anyone love him? Have someone love him, or have him save a cat, do something that makes him make us like him, even though he's an asshole. If you haven't talked about this recently and you have time, I'd like to hear what you have to say. Hey, Jill. Yeah, that's the unlikable protagonist. Unlikable characters. If they're not the protagonist, it's not a problem, because they become antagonists, and you need a good strong antagonist, at least one, if not more. I had a number of good antagonists in the Russian Revolution novels, the two of them, Revolution of Marina M and Chimes of Lost Cathedral. There is a scary antagonist, really a powerful and unstable person. There is also a close friend who can be an antagonist at times. You know, your friends get you into problems that you would not choose on your own, and you know their downsides. Not everybody is likable all the time, you know. Narcissists, Llewellyn was saying, yeah, he says he knows a few good narcissists. The idea of that everybody needs to be likable is just plain wrong. It's the reason there's a lot of, you know, mediocre novels that kind of everything is very sweetie pie, and you have to everybody has to be so likable. I don't know, are people always likable? They vary, if you're writing real people, they're going to have their moments, right? But generally, to have an unlikable character as the protagonist is an interesting, and it's a demanding choice, because you'll know that everybody's going to say, I don't like this person, I don't even want to read. That's where, it's one thing to say, I don't like this person, really an unlikable person, and I don't want to read them. They're two different things, right? Because unlikable people can be incredibly interesting. If they're interesting, entertaining, if we want to see more of them, then perhaps they're not completely unlikable, but they can be a bad person. I mean, look at Humbert. This guy is a predator, but the way he presents himself is so interesting. and your sheer astonishment that he can present himself as a hero when we can see with our own eyes that he's a monster. It's just fascinating. It's fascinating, and we can read a lot of that. We can read a whole novel of that. So it's a point of view question. Nobody is a villain to themselves. So when you get a character who is unlikable, like, what are they doing? Like, why do they do what they do? Try to see it from their point of view. As a writer, you need to know. You don't need to necessarily share that with the reader, but you need to know, like, what, somebody who threatens somebody in a parking lot, or on the freeway, who are gonna whip out their gun and unload into somebody else's car because that person flipped them off or something like that. That's an unlikable person. But what are they thinking? From their point of view, what's the story? And so that's an interesting way to not whitewash them, but to make a more complex character so that we understand what they're doing from their point of view. Then there's also the question of, do you want them to be your protagonist? And when I was writing the short story of that became White Oleander. Actually, it was always called White Oleander, even when it was a short. But originally, that there was no daughter. It was the mother's point of view. And I thought it was kind of a dark comedy, seeing the world through the character's name is Ingrid, through Ingrid's eyes. And people hated her. They did not want to be her. You talk about an unlikable character. Her judgments on things I thought were pretty funny, but people did not find them funny. She's so harsh, so mean. They said, give her a coworker, give her a daughter, give her someone that we can see her through their eyes. What they wanted was a little distance. So in the point of view class, one of the things that I talked about was using a minor character as the point of view character to tell the story of someone else. So Gatsby is told that way. Moby Dick is told that way. Many a story. So you might want to look for Barbara, you might want to have your student look for a minor character who could tell the story and look at this person and give us some understanding of them, as well as a little bit of distance so we don't have to be them. The question is also, perhaps you can give if you don't want to use a minor character as the first person narrator, you can distance your reader from this protagonist a little bit by making it in third person. So you can observe what they're doing, but you can also tell us why they're doing it. You can also give us a little bit of the complexity of that character. There's what they tell people in screenwriting, often people will submit a screenplay and get like terrible advice about it. I mean, I think there's more terrible advice in that world than there is in fiction, the fictional world, because there are people who just are not artists at all and are not used to art and are not thinking about art, giving you suggestions, and they're thinking about the cash register. But generally in fiction, whoever's giving you advice, even people in your your class, your writing class, they just want it to be good. They don't, they're not thinking about the big bucks, such as they are. And the screenwriting advice is to have your character pet the cat. Have them be nice to a kid, be nice to a cat. And so we see that there's a nice side to them. Cheap but efficient, But you don't have to have them pet the cat. You can keep that under your hat as that's a strategy. But you don't have to do that. But it's more understanding why they do what they do. So a character, my husband is like super into Elizabeth Strout, Olive Kitteridge. Oh, he loves all those Olive Kitteridge books. And they're just full of nasty protagonists, really hard asses. And evidently what he thought was best about Olive Kitteridge was, although she was unsympathetic, she lived by a code. And often your unsympathetic people have some idea of why they are living the way they are. There's a basis for their judgmental quality about how they're, judging other people, in this case. And sometimes they take a liking to someone. Sometimes they're helpful. And it doesn't make them, I don't like that likable, not likable, but, a bad person can do you a good turn. And a good person can really screw you up. Life is not all that clear cut. They do something for another reason. My mother had a friend who's had really jerky neighbors. Were they across the street neighbors? Maybe. Usually it's the neighbor next door that's a jerk. But they had really jerky neighbors, always complaining about stuff. And Ozzy Osbourne moved into her neighborhood, like right across the street or right next door. And this woman sent champagne to Ozzy Osbourne because now, the crabby neighbors would really have something to get upset about. And welcome them into the neighborhood. It's so sweet. But sometimes they take a liking to someone, and somebody gets to be the exception to their obnoxious, unsympathetic thing, and it surprises the reader, and it gives a different, flavor then thereafter to the reader's encounter with that character. That character is actually capable of being sympathetic. But in general, they're holding to their curmudgeonly thing or whatever their, most disagreeable quality can be. So surprising us. Another thing that helps us is vulnerability. You have a really cranky, crabby person that has some, maybe has a chronic illness, and people who have, a chronic illness are sometimes, you're not at your best, and people get on your nerves, and but you also have to deal with your colostomy bag or something. I mean, some people just have really hard lives, and it causes them to be really hard on others. But if you intrigue us, little vulnerability, you can also have them, unlikable people sometimes are good champions. like Jeff is saying, Scent of a Woman, and I'll come back and answer a couple of these questions are coming up. They can also like really be the ones to stand up where everybody else is like too nervous about looking like a jerk, that they are willing to be, okay, you know, there's some skeevy person out in front of your house and you're terrified to go, you know, find out what they're doing or why they're doing it. And you have that one crabby neighbor who just is, you know, you call him up and you say, there's this skeevy guy out in front of my house. I'm kind of scared of him. And then that person will come out and read him the riot act. So, you know, sometimes they have their place in the ecosystem. In a Elmore Leonard novel, you'll have somebody who is not a sympathetic person, some kind of lowlife. But then he gets in trouble with like bigger bad guys, and you're sympathetic with them because they're bigger, worse people after them. So that's an interesting move as well. But also, nobody is a villain to themselves. Everybody has a reason for being the way they are. So one of the things I could say about this unlikable protagonist is to not do them in the first person, so the reader doesn't have to be them. You get a little bit of distance in third, or to use a narrator, either a minor character or an authorial voice to stand between the reader and this person. So, you know, think not how can I make this person more likable. That's kind of a superficial approach. You know, have him pet the cat. You know, that's kind of a superficial approach. I think, you know, becoming more complex and using the storytelling, using your tools in storytelling, especially point of view, will be of tremendous help with that one. So we had some questions here. One question, would you be open to the idea of giving a high school commencement speech? I'm one of those people, I can only do one thing at a time, and speech writing is very time consuming. So I have a list I have all my calendar, my appointments and stuff are all in this notebook. And I have a list of things in the beginning of what are the most time-consuming things that I'm asked to do. And I, every once in a while, I take a look at it. And certain things are not time-consuming, more time-consuming, very time-consuming. And writing a speech is very time-consuming. I'll spend like 2 or 3 weeks on it. Traveling to give a speech is very time consuming. It will take a week or so to settle back down when I get home. I'm somebody who does one thing and I do it like in depth. So probably my chances of doing commencement speeches are pretty slim. So Linda said Ingrid, that's the antagonist in White Oleander, was a fascinating character, but a sociopath wouldn't want to be her. Yeah, and you don't want to... People who were good writers, you know, and good readers were saying, we don't want to be her. We give her somebody to see her through. So that's using a minor character as the point of view character in telling the story of this other person, or just authorial narrative, third person. So, you know, being able to pull back a little bit is very good. Unless their voice is Humbert, unless they're just so interesting. But I think if there's already complaints about unsympathetic, I wonder how interesting that voice might be. Yeah, Linda says, unless that's a mystery and they don't know. So Jeffrey says, how do you think that Ingrid's story would play out if she was paired with a much older Marina instead of an Astrid? Well, that's interesting. That'll take some thinking. It's like those mashups. I think that an older Marina would be very impatient with an Ingrid. I think the narcissism, she was somebody who cares very much about other people and cares very much about our impact on each other and our ability to support each other and stuff. And I think she would be kind of horrified by an Ingrid. Yeah, Hitler loved animals and small children. See, that's the pet the cat thing. Yeah. Does it make him likable? It's just an interesting aspect of personality. There was one other question I wanted to get to before we moved on. Jeff said Al Pacino in Scent of a Woman, having physical disability. All right, and the next, so always ask yourself, if you have this problem with an unsympathetic character, your protagonist, that people are telling you, we don't want to be this person. We find this person, really hard to take. I don't think I could read a whole novel in this person's voice and stuff. Is the time to ask yourself, are you telling the story from the right point of view? There's a lot. That's a more interesting way and more solid way to approach the problem than just having them pet a cat, rescue a kid or something. The next question is from Jane. So if Jane is watching, would you consider in your next Writing Wednesday talking about backstory? I am particularly interested in advice how to transition to passages of backstory. I am writing a very tight first-person present tense. I know, but it works in the pace of my story and in the moment war photographer character. I find it natural to slip in a few paragraphs of backstory during thoughtful reflection, but I struggle to find an organic way in longer passages to an organic way in to longer passages of backstory, which are necessary for the story. It feels clunky to go from present to past tense, and I'm uneasy with the slightly uncanny total recall aspect of passages of detailed dialogue and description from years ago. Does anyone really remember the past in that kind of detail? Grateful for any advice you can offer for my struggle with the past. Thanks again, Jane. Okay, so this is for Jane's question. We're going to do it in reverse order. The first question is the author's unease with the total recall aspect of a character remembering backstory. Like, how could they remember it that well? I think that's where the suspension of disbelief in fiction writing comes in. I mean, certainly every memoirist has to deal with that. Like, how could they possibly remember this in that kind of detail? They don't. But the pleasure of actually being able to go into real-time scenes of the past, the reader is able to overcome reluctance or knowledge that nobody could remember stuff in that kind of detail. So I wouldn't sweat that. as much. You know, people get a little bit too worried about the verisimilitude of narration. You worry about it more, like in history. You know, I don't want to see a scene that isn't, you know, enacted in a dramatized way. In real history, you have narrative. You use narrative, and you say, you know, Trotsky said of this meeting, quote, and then you can do, you know, you can insert what Trotsky said, well, that what he noticed about being there, or some other figure who was present, then you quote them. But in history, you never reenact a scene. No. It's the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And I know creative nonfiction is this very interesting place in the middle where liberties are taken, the recreation of scene and stuff. So it's, you know, it's more, that kind of creative nonfiction is more, has more in common with memoir. And you just are allowed, the reader tends to hold back the disbelief for the pleasure of the enactment. Fiction, on the other hand, the whole suspension of disbelief thing is much easier for the reader, knowing that they're reading fiction. So yeah, so if the character wants to have a memory story about something in a chapter, have a chapter that's relating the past, a past scene, and having it dramatized, which means real time, people speak and stuff. You don't have to worry as much about that. You know, the suspicion of slightly uncanny total recall. It might seem more worrisome to the writer than to the reader. But then we're going to get into the kind of the crux of the situation. She says it feels clunky to go from present tense to past tense. But she's very firm on wanting that first person present tense. I go, I shoot, it's a war photographer, you know, I dive behind the, you know, whether you need that or not, that's seems to be off the table. You know, this is somebody who wants that. My idea, if taking a break or moving to the next chapter to indicate to the reader that, you know, either space down or go to the next chapter, and then have a chapter entirely in backstory, I would consider pulling it out of present tense and using, because she's saying that the switch between present and past in the first person, that's being, the present of the story is being narrated in first person present tense, and it's suddenly go, I did, or back in Czechoslovakia in 1945, you know, I was living in blah, blah, blah. And if she's finding that too big not too big, but like an awkward break in tense, that the tense is causing a stumble, that the reader is like, wait a second, that just doesn't seem right. Think about doing the past in third. So the voice it's very different. And the reader isn't trying to piece them together. They're not trying to knit them together. It's very clear. Okay, now we're just going to be in third person past tense, and these are going to be separate type of thing. But the caveat about that would be, you have to do it on a regular basis. You can't do it like twice or three times and then not do it again. It's either if you're going to go into third, it either has to be part of the story and a regular rhythm of it. Otherwise, it's that there's a stumble there. It's like, why do we have three, third person, past tense, and everything else is in present? I'm not, as people who have took this weekend workshop that I just taught on point of view, present tense first person is very fun to write. It's very immediate, and you get to do the ventriloquism of being that character, but it's not the most flexible of points of view. You find yourself very much with your face in the carpet of the present. You're in that car and stuff is like coming like this. It's hard to get, not just she's saying, I can do like a paragraph of backstory. As I'm lying in the hammock, rocking myself, with my foot up against the tree trunk. And, I can remember being in Sarajevo in 73, that place that we rented. You can drift into past, but she's saying she's going to get a big block of some backstory issue that needs to be dealt with. So we're in war photography. We can drift over to Sarajevo in 73. But if you wanted a chapter of my childhood in Cincinnati in the 50s, you would I would go into past tense and make it very clear where you are, when you are. I'm lying in the hospital in, what's a war zone? I'm lying in the hospital in Afghanistan, and the nurse comes to do whatever. You go back and forth from present to past. But if you wanted a chapter of backstory, a chapter of the past, you would probably put the date, the place, you can do this, Cincinnati, Ohio, 1959. My brother was fixated on President Eisenhower. He would draw President Eisenhower. He would try to imitate his, avuncular delivery of blah, 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 blah. I was 4, but I still remembered blah, 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 blah. And just go with that. You will have to find a way to settle your reader into past, but you have to make a break. You have to put a big line space and then start the next, because that shows that you're changing time, or a new chapter if it's a full chapter. And you can have, in first you can do voicey stuff. You can say, I don't really remember my mother, doing X, Y, and Z, but the family story maintains blah, 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 blah. So you can do that. You work with the point of view. If you've chosen that first person and you want to keep it first person and go, you need to be able to go back in the past. In a present tense story, if you're doing the past, I remember being there and it smelled like this, and then you're in the past tense and it smelled like this and it looked like this, and my brother was doing this, and then get to the, then you'll evolve the point of what you're doing. But it is, first is always less forgiving. There's a lot you have to really work hard to make happen in first, even though it's a simple, way of telling a story. I do this, I do this, I do this, and it's everything's coming in. You can only see what that character sees. You can't ever see them. It's very difficult. You have to really work to get in description of your character. And your reader's kind of frozen into their point of view, and the focal length, the distance between the reader's camera, the character's camera, and the reader. They're right here inside the head, and they're going to be there, and you can get kind of tired of that, if your character isn't really interesting. There's a lot less you can do, but they've already chosen to do it. So yeah, you're going to have to make a new chapter for the backstory scene, and you're going to have to set it up really well so that your reader comes along with you in that. I try not to have big passages of backstory. I try to, what she was saying, how she paces, she can slip in a few paragraphs of backstory, and always in context with the present story. So you're going to have thoughtful backstory. You're going to be, for a paragraph or two, you're going to sit in your booth in the diner, and you're drinking your coffee, and then something is going to remind you of the past, whatever it is that comes to mind. And then, I remember when my brother did that, and then you give that little bit of backstory, and then you come back, and then the waitress is pouring you coffee. You're back in the present, and then if you want to go back into the past again, and then there's a rhythm, but always have your character coming back, because we know what the present story is. If you're going to have more than just that weaving, I like to trigger a backstory bit, but always remember that your foreground is that the character is physically somewhere having these thoughts. When you have a big backstory thing, you can just, I remember the day that, my father walked out. Cincinnati, 1959. My brother was, 13, and I remember sitting there watching him shave, and so forth and so on, and then get into your story. So Linda says, if the reader doesn't know the narrator's a bad guy, that was the last question, like the Agatha Christie character. Yeah, well, the unlikable character, the reader will know. That's the problem that the person was having. What else can I tell you? I always like I don't mind the first person in the present and the third person in the past. Is very interesting. Another way of handling it is, in my point of view class, we looked at The Lover by Marguerite Duras, which is a present past story, where the past is the important stuff of the novel is in the past part rather than in the present part, where it sounds like Jane's, the most important part of the story is in the present. The Lover, it's about the events of this 15-year-old girl's life in Vientiane, Vietnam, when it was French, the French colony, and her involvement with the lover. But it's told from the point of view of an older self. And what's interesting is the older self is in past tense, and the girl, the story of the girl in the past is in present tense. So play with tenses as well. and see how that works. Oh, Jane, good, you're here. I'm glad you heard that. So I hope that was helpful. Just giving you a couple of ideas there. So let's see if there's anything else anybody wants to ask me about. My head is very much in point of view still. It'll take me a while to recover from that. The unlikable character is such an interesting person. Good for especially good in short story, but in a long, a novel, I don't think we have to have some wiggle room with them. They can be maybe more than one point of view character, so you can move around a little bit so the reader doesn't become exhausted trying to empathize with your unlikable character. Or some of these other moves that make the story more complex and surprising, that these people surprise you. It's often interesting to get another perspective on them. And people can share things that maybe that person wouldn't even share about themselves, somebody who, claims to be this victim. I'm such a victim of all these, everybody's picking on me, narcissist. And then you get another view of them, of just how how difficult they are on other people. But I'm sure that that's already there. The first person in the unsympathetic character is very interesting because nobody sees themselves as unsympathetic. Everybody thinks that they're right, and they have a reason for doing what they're doing, and that they're right. And it can be enraging, It's very interesting. All right. Well, this looks like, I don't seem to have any more questions on point of view. So it was very nice to get these questions. Thank you. And I wish you good writing for the week. And we'll see you next week for Writing Wednesday. And please, if you have questions, go ahead and send them to me in my on my website and on the contact sheet, and I can do one of these around your question. Oh, and Barbara's here too. Well, thank you. Thank you for the questions. I always appreciate that, and wish you all good writing. Okay, bye.